There is a lot of shame in being Filipino in my family. I'm going to go back to that theme as well, just to kind of connect it, because my parents never valued the Filipino beauty. My mother always thought I would look prettier if I looked like a China doll or I looked like a Japanese baby. So she would cut my hair in bangs and like a bob, which is funny because last year I cut my hair like that. It brought up memories of my childhood, of my mother being like, oh, like you're so beautiful, like everyone mistakes you as Chinese or Japanese.
Oh, man, that's heavy.
I don't know, it's very interesting. I have a connection to Japan also because the stories always change, but everyone goes overseas to make money. They like send the money back to their family, and so the economy is just driven by like outsourcing that money. And so my mom was the only family to leave to America, but her two sisters moved to Japan and actually worked at a hostess club. And they were sex workers. But the story that my mother told me was that they were sold to Japanese men. And so I have half Japanese, half Filipino cousins there. And in 2016, I went to visit them for the very first time and didn't realize there was a huge community of Filipino, Japanese people there in Shizuoka, specifically where my two aunts work. And they both run different hostess clubs. So they recruit Filipino women who need, money. And I was there. Me and my mom were just sitting in the hostess booth, just like watching all these like women like fight each other. Yeah, it was very interesting. And then like, I don't know why my mother never really brought it up, but she always said that they were sold. But in my eyes, it was like, oh, this is just how our culture is. It's like every story that I hear from every mother or parents that left the Philippines, came just to make money and then ended up living in where they are.
Wow, I love that perspective. It reminds me of, have you ever read Oryx and Crake by Margaret Atwood?
No, I'm going to write that down. Orson and Crake.
It's a great end of the world story by the great Margaret Atwood. And in that story, there's hopefully I'm not going to ruin too much. Spoiler alert, but there's one bit about it, which is that there's a woman, she came from a small village, maybe in Thailand or something. There's like flashback memories of how she was sold to sex work or something like that. The male protagonist in this book was always really upset about it because, there's a kind of like savior mentality of the man. And he's always going on about how, oh, that's so fucking terrible. And I'm going to find that guy who like sold you or sex trafficked you, and I'm gonna like get revenge and like kill that guy or something. And then the woman was like, what's your problem? Like, it's not that big of a deal. Not saying it's not a big deal, but for me, when I read it the first time, I was kind of like, because it's a long book. It gives you like over a long period of time and gets you into the perspective of also that woman. It's not to say that sex work or sex trafficking is good or bad. It's not a discussion of that, but just simply the concept in which people project about the idea of it. And we're not actually talking about the actual thing yet. It's just pure fantasy in the sense like, let's say when your mom's selling you the idea that they were sold, right? There's not the discussion of what they did or didn't do, but that's the kind of idea that dramatizes, or it's just a different picture than reality. I remember when I was like, my parents are Buddhists, but they sent me to Seventh-day Adventist and then later a Lutheran school, not because they were Christians or wanted me to Christian. Actually, they were open for me to become Christian, which I find very interesting in terms of geopolitics, because the way I see it now, religion is not only about religion and spirituality or theology and philosophy, but it's a geopolitics, and who controls symbolism controls the narrative, and who controls the narrative dictates power structures. What's interesting was the way that my parents, especially my mother, I think my mother definitely was running the show more. She understood and saw that with a white Christian education, that will improve and increase her idea of integration and being more part of it. Like this whole term of like integrating, for me, that's super toxic. It's the opposite of having healthy boundaries and authenticity and being who you are, because it's about adapting literally the enemies, literally people who colonized us, literally people who are putting us down.
Hmm.
And I'm not saying this like death to all white people, simply more like, hey, let's call a spade a spade. It's that the process of integration is a process of violence. And
Yeah.
it's interesting that my mom was open to the fact that I would internalize a different ideology and a different power structure where we fit in the bottom, like Stockholm syndrome.
Mm.
It's interesting during that period. So my father would say these memories are just coming back. It's kind of funny that I didn't really have much of a sex education because they didn't really have that language either. But
Hmm.
my father would say, when I first discovered porn and my dad discovered that the computer in the history and like in the cookies, that's when I discovered cookies and cash was because they were filled with my dirty laundry list of like, as a kid and watching it. And then he was like, he didn't know how to say or communicate any of that stuff. And he
Yeah.
just said like, he alluded to human sex trafficking. He said basically
Okay.
porn is bad because there's sex trafficking. But the thing is, now as an adult, I'm like, yeah, there's sex trafficking, but not all porn is sex trafficking, or there's different degrees of sex trafficking, and not all sex work is one idea of sex work and one idea of sex trafficking. And but for him, it was like, that's it. You watch porn, you're supporting, pedophilic, sex trafficking, whatever. So it's kind of interesting that you go to Japan and have this whole experience. But can you talk to your mom about your experience in sex work?
Oh, I don't think none of my family knows. I think my brothers have an inkling about it because for me to survive college, I did sex work.